Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Chicago Wilderness Alliance Café. My name is Laura Riley. I'm the coordinator of Chicago Wilderness. We're going to give it a few more minutes to let folks join us. We're excited about our topic today, Trails for Wildlife and People, presented by Becky Collins, Lydia Euler, and Jim Ziemba. I wanted to let you know that this presentation will be recorded and it will be posted on our website along with a PDF of the slides. We'll also send that out to everyone who registered, so you'll be receiving that in an email follow-up information. All right, we're going to give it a few more, just a minute more. Folks are still joining us. Okay. As I mentioned, my name is Laura Riley. I'm the coordinator of Chicago Wilderness. It's great to see so many of you here today. I wanted to send a quick invitation. Next week, we have our Conservation Congress at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I hope that if you haven't already registered, that you're able to join us. I'm sending some information here in the chat, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it directly afterwards. Okay. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lydia Euler from the Forest Reserves of Cook County.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. My name is Lydia Euler, and I work as a project analyst with the Office of the General Superintendent at the Forest Preserves of Cook County. I wanted to start today's meeting by reading the Forest Preserve's land acknowledgement statement. But I also wanted to encourage everyone else on this meeting today to take the time to input in the chat whose ancestral lands that you live or work on. There's going to be a link that's going to be posted in the chat, and you can search that if you aren't aware already, and you can post it in the chat. The Forest Preserves of Cook County acknowledges that we're on the lands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, as well as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki peoples. As a land management agency, we acknowledge that we played a role in shaping the histories of local Native Americans by acquiring this land. We also recognize, share, and celebrate their immemorial ties to this land. We commit ourselves to developing deeper partnerships that advocate for the progress, dignity, and humanity of the many diverse Native Americans who still live and practice their heritage and traditions on this land today. Thank you. Okay, Laura, can you launch a poll? We wanted to launch this poll before we get started with our presentation to get a better understanding of our group today. And while she's doing that, I'm going to introduce my colleagues who will be presenting with me today. I'm here today with Becky Collins, who's our senior resource ecologist with our agency's resource management department, and Jim Ziemba, a GIS specialist with our planning and development department. All right. A lot of nonprofits and governments. Cool. Okay, so this project started when a group of our staff from the Forest Preserve viewed a webinar, which was titled Trails for People and Wildlife. And Jim Ayler from the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department discussed trail impacts to wildlife, and he presented on a tool that they developed as an agency to help mitigate those impacts, but while also allowing people to enjoy nature. So today we're presenting on this trail mapping tool and demoing a model that we developed. The goal of this presentation is not only to demo this model and explain how this type of tool can be utilized in future trail planning to potentially help mitigate existing trail impacts, but also to discuss how other land management agencies can utilize similar mitigation tools. So most people don't realize the impacts that human presence can have on wildlife. The type of impact and the seriousness of the impact depend on the species of animal, the time of day, seasonality, and the location of the trail. You can see on the slide, there can be physical and behavioral changes, issues with reproductive success, and even increased predation. There are also issues with physical impacts to the habitat that wildlife depend on, like erosion, and even more direct impacts that can lead to mortality, like running over snakes or turtles while using a trail. And while most of these impacts may be short-term while on the trail, there can still be significant long-term consequences for wildlife. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quick, and I want to play an excerpt from the webinar that we watched. I think that it's best just to watch this excerpt. It's about 7 minutes long. It kind of helps put trail impacts in more perspective. It provides real world examples and presents the scientific studies that indicate trail impacts to wildlife. And we're going to include a link in the chat for the full webinar. So if you have time and you're interested, you can watch the entire presentation Jim Ayler gives. So give me one moment while I bring up the webinar excerpt. All right.
All these impacts from trails on wildlife were reviewed and summarized very well in a couple of papers. First one, a review of the impacts of nature-based recreation on birds, published in the Journal of Environmental Management. These authors reviewed 69 papers of research that was done in the US and England and Argentina, mostly temperate regions of the world. 88% of those studies indicated significant negative impacts on birds. Second paper, effects of recreation on animals revealed as widespread through global systematic review. This was published in PLOS ONE in 2016. These authors reviewed 274 papers, research that was done in North America and Europe, all taxa, not just birds. So it covered reptiles and amphibians, mammals, and birds. And let me take you through some of the results here. Let's look at cross-country skiing and snowshoeing. Those researchers reviewed 9 papers that address cross-country skiing and snowshoeing. Those 9 papers reported on 27 results. Of those 27 results, a little over 50% indicated significant negative impacts on wildlife. Hiking and running, 112 papers were reviewed. Those papers reported on 792 results. Of those, just short of 50% showed significant negative impacts on wildlife. Biking, 24 papers reviewed, 253 results reported, again, just shy of 50% significant negative impacts. Regardless of what outdoor activity you're engaged in, regardless of where you're doing it, you're likely having an impact on wildlife. And it may not be impacts on wildlife that we typically think of when we hear the word wildlife, things that we are commonly used to our presence. Deer in some cases, raccoons, coyotes, cardinals, robins. Those things get used to our presence, generally speaking. But we have nearly 500 different species of wildlife that call New Hampshire home. A lot of them will be impacted by recreation. I'm thinking of things like Blanding's turtles, the snakes that I mentioned earlier that I almost ran over, and different neotropical migrant songbirds, ovenbirds, veeries, wood thrushes, what have you. Some real world examples, some researchers up in Ontario did some bird research on 24 conservation lands up in that province. And they found on those conservation lands with trails, they certainly found birds, but comparatively far fewer birds than on conservation lands with few or no trails. And if you think about that, the fewer the birds you have, the less healthy the local population is, the less recruitment or the less young being produced in that local population. And consider that a lot of these species migrate southward to South America during the winter. So it's not only affecting local populations, but even in some senses, global populations. Another example, researchers did some long-term research on wood turtles on a large conservation parcel in Connecticut. A very healthy, robust population of wood turtles for many, many, many years. Trails were introduced onto those conservation lands, and over time, the population declined ever, to the extent that the population blinked out altogether. And they looked at a variety of different factors, and after eliminating those factors, they just didn't make sense. It was really trails and the human disturbance associated with trails that led to the demise of that population. People like turtles, they like collecting turtles. They're a long-lived species. They don't reproduce very well. You take an individual out here and there, and you're going to have an impact on the health of that population. And the impacts of trails is not just on the trail footprint itself. Wildlife see and hear is coming for quite a distance, and it depends on the type of wildlife you're talking about, but we reviewed 67 different articles from New England or as close to New England as possible to determine what the disturbance distance was off trail for wildlife. And we found that in general, reptiles and amphibians flee within 60 feet of disturbance. Birds do as well. Birds become alert within 150 feet of disturbance, and mammals up to 400 feet away from disturbance. Now, this morning I went for a walk on some local conservation lands along a trail near a wetland, and I flushed up 4 wood ducks. And I tell you what, those wood ducks were not within 60 feet. They were much further away. So these are numbers that are in general, but you can actually flush some birds at far greater distances than just 60 feet. But even that 400-foot distance is quite significant when you compare it to a football length of a football field. We're talking 1/3 football field lengths. You can disturb wildlife off of a trail. So let's look at the present day reality for our trail system. So this is the town of Durham in the southeastern part of the state. And the green polygons are conservation lands. The red lines are official recreational trails built and maintained by the landowners or volunteers with permission of the landowners. The yellow are social trails that were just built by recreational users without the permission of the landowners. And you add onto that the municipal roads and state highways, and do the 400-foot disturbance buffer, and this is what you have left. In the town of Durham, the biggest undisturbed patch of habitat is less than 1 square mile. And Durham is not unique. You could take the town of Hollis, where I live, and if you did the same analysis, it would look very similar, guarantee it. The city of Concord, same. And I suspect in many towns in New Hampshire, if you did that analysis, it would look very similar to what you're seeing right here. Now, we only have so much land in the state, anywhere really, right? And we chop it up with residential and commercial development and agriculture, roads. We need all these things for sure. But we are also chopping up our conservation lands with trails, and how much undisturbed habitat is there going to be left for wildlife? And again, not just the wildlife that get used to our presence, but all wildlife. And so we decided at New Hampshire Fish and Game it would be prudent to provide a tool to help landowners and land managers site recreational trails with wildlife in mind, provide opportunities for folks to get outside and reap the benefits of nature, appreciate nature, but also provide opportunities for wildlife, all wildlife, to thrive.
think you're muted, Lydia.
Sorry. So someone else is sharing their screen. So, okay. Sorry, you can just see from that excerpt a little bit of the webinar. If you're interested in watching the full webinar, again, the link should be in the chat. I'm gonna go back to our presentation. Give me 1 second. Okay. So the final piece of that excerpt mentioned this mapping trail tool and the reasons for its development. The Forest Preserves created this working group that developed out of watching that webinar, and then we decided to create and demo our own mapping tool, very similar to the New Hampshire version. And the purpose of this tool is to help the Forest Preserves determine the most suitable locations for trails in order to lessen impacts to wildlife. This tool delivers two mechanisms for evaluating trails. The first is the trail suitability, which uses key principles, which Becky will go over shortly, to help determine, which trail segments are most appropriate and the least problematic. The second is the corridor of influence, which uses a buffer of 400 feet on either side of the trail to demonstrate the area of impact humans have along a trail. So now Jim and Becky are going to go into more detail about the trail model that we developed and, go over a case study.
Thanks, Lydia.
Actually, can I pause right there? Lydia, by any chance, can you close your bars? Because I think they're blocking somehow the screen. It creates like a gray shadow.
Yeah.
Can you minimize or eliminate those? I've never seen this before.
I'll figure it out. Sorry, if you could start, Becky. I'm trying to figure out how to minimize them.
Well, you got one off. That was good. And there's one more. Oh, now it's back.
I think it might be the chat and the taskbar.
I don't have those up though.
Shoot.
Well, let me stop sharing and share again. Maybe that's what the problem is.
Thanks for your patience, everybody.
No, it's still there.
It's still there.
Sorry. Oh, hide floating meeting controls. Is that better?
Yeah, but there's a box in the middle. There you go.
Okay.
All right, thanks. All right, as Lydia mentioned, we looked at establishing a GIS model that can help us determine suitable locations for trails. So there were 4 key principles that we included in our model. The first was looking at slope, and this factor was given a negative weight in the model, since trails on slopes often lead to soil erosion. You can kind of see this in the photo we have here at Tinley Creek Ravines. There was a trail that became a gully for water to flow down slope, and that led to severe soil erosion. Also, if there's a stream at the end of that trail, that sediment will wash into the stream, and that can affect aquatic organisms. Also, south-facing slopes tend to be hibernacula for snakes. So for those reasons, slope was given a negative weight in our model. The second factor we looked at was habitat edge. And this was given a positive weight in the model, so that pushes trails to the edge of the preserve and protects the habitat core. The third layer we looked at, or factor we looked at, was a layer we created called special habitat areas. So our staff put together a special data layer that included high quality and uncommon habitats such as fens, dolomite prairie, locations of threatened and endangered species, and then special habitat features like osprey platforms, bald eagle nests, etc. And then the last factor we included was wetlands, and this was also given a negative weight in our model. And this is because wetlands tend to be areas where there's high concentrations of wildlife, particularly amphibians and reptiles. And these are animals that don't just live in the wetland, they're moving in and out of the wetland. So it's not a great place to put a trail near a wetland because as animals are moving in and out of that habitat, they're susceptible to the impacts of trails. So I think Jim is next and he'll tell us a little bit more about the model, the GIS model.
Okay, thanks, Becky. Oh, can we go back one slide? Thank you.
Jim, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to tell me to move to the next slide because
Okay,
okay.
no problem. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the approach we took to assemble our own trail suitability model. So as Becky just explained, there were 4 key parameters considered when measuring trail impacts to wildlife, and they were slope, habitat edge, special habitat areas, and wetlands. Our first task in building the model was gathering together various GIS data sets for each of these categories. We then grouped measurable values within each data set into a simplified and uniform ranking of potential impact to wildlife. So for example, trail sections that fall within or very close to a wetland would receive a ranking of 3, which corresponds with the highest level of impact to wildlife, while an area far away from a wetland would receive a ranking of 1, corresponding to a low level of impact. The model was then built to aggregate all this information and output a single trail suitability heat map where we could visualize the cumulative impact of all 4 parameters within any given area. Okay, next slide, please. So this table summarizes the data buckets or groupings we created for each of the 4 model inputs. For slopes, we classified 0 to 10 degrees into the least sensitive category to wildlife, and anything over 15 degrees into the most sensitive category. Edge and wetlands were grouped by various distances from an edge or wetland, and special habitats were grouped based on the presence or absence of high quality remnant prairies, recent restoration projects, threatened and endangered species, rare plants, uncommon habitats, and known bird nesting sites. Okay. So this is an example of what the heat map looks like. The idea is that the areas showing up darkest red would indicate the most sensitivity for wildlife, and the blue or cooler colored areas are least sensitive for wildlife. When we overlay existing or proposed trail data over this heat map, we can begin to see where specific sections of trail could be impacting wildlife, and then might use this information to start thinking about different approaches we might take to mitigate those impacts. So for instance, in this image, the trail shown traveling through the red, highly sensitive areas might be considered for decommissioning or rerouting through a less sensitive blue area nearby in order to reduce impacts to wildlife. So as explained in the presentation, the corridor of influence analysis measures the effect of trail density on wildlife habitat within a given area. It's a separate GIS exercise, but can be used in combination with the heat map to help make additional trail planning decisions. So to measure corridor of influence, we apply a 400-foot buffer to all trails within a landscape unit to calculate the total area of wildlife habitat being impacted. And any areas falling outside of this buffer zone would then be considered uninfluenced by trails. So for example, in these figures, the red blob you're seeing represents the area of influence for all trails within this particular landscape. And the the 38-acre piece that is highlighted yellow would be the largest remaining tract of uninfluenced wildlife. In the lower images, you can see that by eliminating two relatively small trail segments adjacent that 38-acre piece, almost 60 additional acres of habitat could be freed up, which results in a total of 98 acres or 93 acres, sorry. So if we apply this analysis to certain areas in the forest preserves where we have networks of trails that are very densely spaced, it can help us identify small sections that might not be necessary and could potentially be decommissioned to provide significant gains in higher quality wildlife habitat. Okay, I'll turn it back to Becky to talk about a case study that we did.
All right, thanks. So in order to get started in the forest preserves of Cook County, we decided to pilot this trail suitability model at a few locations, including our Tinley Creek Preserve. This is a 500-acre preserve. It's located in the southwestern part of Cook County near Oak Forest and Oak. The Forest Preserve has recently completed a 500-acre restoration project here. So you can kind of see the photo in the middle of your screen. This is what the preserve looked like before restoration. There's a lot of bare ground and very dense trees that were kind of shading the ground layer. And after restoration, we have removed invasive brush and thin trees. So we're now seeing an increase in ground layer vegetation and less bare ground. So as a part of the restoration project, especially as we're nearing the end of kind of the vegetation work, we wanted to take a closer look at a network of unofficial trails that traverses this property. So the photo on your left, the white trail is our paved official forest preserve trail. And the yellow lines, these are unofficial, like social trails that have been created through the preserve. There's a network of more than 10 miles of unofficial trail. So we decided this would be a good location to test out the model and look at establishing some more permanent like trail loops and then closing some of the remainder. So I think Jim's going to show how this model was applied here to these trails.
Okay, so this is the trail suitability heat map that we generated for the case study area. So as I mentioned earlier, the more red or hot the color, the higher the score and more sensitive an area is to wildlife impacts. So you can see upon first glance that the center of the Tinley Creek Ravines area is the most sensitive and is also where many of the unrecognized trails happen to be located. The deepest red areas you see on the map are where we would find overlaps in coverage of steep slopes, wetlands, special habitats, and areas that are far away from a habitat edge. So you can begin to see right away that this provides a quick visual snapshot of potential problem areas on trails and can also be useful for identifying areas to avoid during initial trail planning phases. So another thing we can do to make the model output more useful is to transfer those sensitivity scores directly onto our trail lines. So now you can see that all those unrecognized trails have taken on the heat map colors, which allows us to more easily pinpoint which specific trail segments are potentially problematic. So this is taking a look at the corridor of influence for the existing trails. So if we measure out 400 feet around all of the trails at Tinley Creek Ravines, this is what we get. As you can see, this big yellow blob, which is about 500 acres, covers almost the entire landscape unit. So currently there's effectively no wildlife habitat that would be considered uninfluenced by trail use. Okay, so now I want to apply the model and the corridor tools to the proposed Tinley Creek trail loops Becky introduced earlier. So if you recall, there are these three options that are being considered for formal recognition. And the idea is that we would then close or decommission any remaining unrecognized trails in this area. So using the suitability model, we can quickly assess each trail option individually. So as we can see, the third option travels through some sensitive areas, while the first two options seem to travel through mostly cool or low sensitivity areas. And we might use this information to toss out that third option altogether, or consider rerouting portions of it if we want to still include it. Okay, now if we apply the corridor of influence for just these proposed trails, we can see that the area impacted is much smaller compared to that original yellow blob for the unrecognized trails at Tinley Ravines. So the idea is that if all the trails to the north were eventually decommissioned after formalizing only these three trails, we could potentially free up hundreds of acres of habitat from influence by trail users. Okay, so those were the main things I wanted to demonstrate with the Tinley Creek Ravines case study. If anyone has any questions, we can open it up now for discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks, Becky, and thanks to everyone for your attention. I just want to remind everyone that this tool is not the end-all be-all for trail planning at the forest preserves, but it's a tool many of us here think that is necessary in utilizing so we can understand what type of impacts a project or a trail might have on wildlife and nature, which our mission compels us to protect. And there are other factors that go into determining whether a trail in a particular location is appropriate. And while human enjoyment and access to nature are important in considering this particular tool just focuses on impacts to wildlife. I also want to mention that we did reach out to the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department to see what other agencies have replicated this tool. And we were told that only sister agencies in New Hampshire and then a few on the East Coast have replicated or looked into using a similar tool, and that we actually are the furthest afield that they know of. So Laura, would you mind launching that other poll? We just want to see what you thought about today's presentation. We have some discussion questions, if any of you want to answer, or we're happy to, answer any questions that you have about the tool or our process, if you're interested in starting getting your own tool.
And I see that there were a few questions in the chat.
Chat.
I can read them out. Actually, Floyd Catchpole said, was there a reason roads and paved trails weren't included in the analysis?
Jim, you want to take that one?
Yeah, we've talked about including roads subsequently, and it's something that's going to be added in the near future to the model. And same with paved trails. I think they'll be added together. The only question is how much of a buffer should we use for roads? And I think we need to do a little more research into whether that should be 400 feet like it is for the unpaved trails or something greater based on whatever research is out there.
Thank you. There's another one from Kevin Kuhn. He said, please share examples of forest preserve Cook County sites that have been closed due to overuse. And he said, well done, and thank you.
Becky, I don't know if you want to take that.
I don't think we've actually effectively closed any trails as a result of this analysis. So I know we have tried in a few locations, but this is something that we're still trying to figure out the best way of how to close unofficial trails. So if anyone has successful examples of that from other agencies, we would definitely be interested. We have in some locations, put up signage, and that's been somewhat effective, but I can't think of a site where we have actually 100% closed an unofficial trail. During COVID, there were some forest preserves that were very popular, and the impacts from that use or overuse was negatively affecting the resource. So we did close some parking lots during that time in order to lessen the impact. But that's obviously a little bit easier than closing an unofficial trail.
Yeah, I would say that would be maybe the next step in this this process. We just wanted to figure out how to use this trail, look at some of these social trails like the Tinley Creek Ravines example, and figure out what the best trail route would be. So I think the next step, again, like Becky said, we haven't figured that out, and that's part of the process.
There's a question from Henrietta Sanders, and she asked, have you thought about how you'll educate the public who may be used to using the informal trails when they are decommissioned?
Yeah, I think that's, again, on the next step. We will be hopefully having a working group looking into that. This was just more of a looking at this tool to study impacts to trail or to wildlife from our trail system, and not just the unrecognized social trails. Also, it's hopefully going to be utilized when we're planning any new trails as well. So that wasn't really part of this process, but it is something that we are interested in looking at, and hopefully we'll do so soon.
Yeah, and Lydia, can I add, this is Kathy Garrity. This is a start to educating people in general about what how trails affect wildlife. And I think we welcome suggestions from everyone to spread the word about the impact trails have. And I think most people would prefer not to interfere or not to cause damage to wildlife. So I think it's getting people to understand, because most of us, and I was one of them, thought that trails were sort of benign, but they aren't necessarily.
Yeah, I agree. This actually blew my mind, this information. Mark Johnson asks, is there a way this model could be shared with other GIS users?
Jim?
Yeah, so our model actually incorporates some sensitive data with the special habitat areas. So I don't know that we could share it completely, but there was really good documentation from the work that they did in New Hampshire regarding how they built their model, which is basically what we used to form our own. And then there was also some information available from Esri that was related to building something similar. So I'd be happy to share both of those resources and answer any more detailed technical questions for GIS folks.
Any other questions, Laura?
Yeah, so there's Tim Holloway asks, are there any differentiation between different types of trails? For example, 10-foot asphalt trails versus 6-foot wild wood chip trail versus a boardwalk?
Jim, that's for you.
Not, no. So like that 400-foot buffer would be the same for any type of trail that is included in the analysis.
Okay.
And we don't necessarily have information about trail usage, like how much usage different trails receive. But any trail is going to have some impact to wildlife. And so it doesn't matter what the size is, there will be some impact. So yeah, I don't know if there's been any studies to look at the different types of trails, like I guess you would, something that's, has 100 people every day versus like 10 people every day is going to have more of an impact, but that didn't factor into our model. We were just looking at just trail impact in general.
Okay. Amy Lardner asks, how do you envision using trail mapping to coordinate human access, including bike trails and forest preserves that adjoin or connect with those of urban park systems?
For that, I would direct you to our web map that has, it's an interactive map that has really good information on all of our trails and connections to municipal trails. So that would probably be your best resource as a human for utilizing our trail system.
Okay, thank you. Pamela Selsky asked, doesn't current forest reserve ordinance allow people to walk anywhere except in nature preserves?
Yes, our ordinance allows that, I think, but that's not what we would promote to people. We do ask our trail, rules on our website ask people to stay on designated trails. So I think that's something we'll have to discuss in the future, for all those unrecognized trails, but this specific tool is just looking at impacts to wildlife on our trail system. Are there any other ones?
There's just a comment from Robert Crawford that states that restricting dogs will reduce impacts on wildlife. Probably not a very popular suggestion with the public.
Yes, I think leashing dogs is definitely an issue. I think that dog impact versus human impact, I don't know if that's been studied, but any type of impact that's, humans and dogs together walking on a trail is going to impact. But if a dog or a human is going off trail, that's probably going to have a greater impact. So that's a whole nother conversation, I think. But I think just utilizing a tool like this will be really helpful for us in determining, trail placement in the future. And then also maybe if we are able to figure out how to decommission some of these social unrecognized trails, what the best placement is for that.
Mhm.
Is there any, does anyone want to answer any of these discussion questions? Does anyone feel that a tool like this would be helpful for their organization? I know there are a lot of nonprofits represented here, but many of you work with landholding agencies or hold land yourselves. Is this something that other people would be interested in developing? Well,
it looks like one person at least is asking if we could share the model with other GIS users. So
yeah, and Laura will be emailing everybody a PDF of the slides and the resources that we provided today. So if anyone is interested in reaching out to us, if you want us to talk to any of your leadership about this, or trail planners about this tool, we're happy to. Also can connect you with the New Hampshire Fish and Game. They have that link that was posted in the chat earlier has a handbook that kind of describes the process I think Jim mentioned. So that is also a helpful tool.
I'll just jump in for a second to say that I'm at Field Museum, Mark Johnston. We're looking at kind of doing some urban wildlife corridor analysis work. And so we're kind of looking at what the effects trails like this might have on sort of what makes an effective corridor. So yeah, it might be great to tap into what you guys have worked on to do something similar with the trails aspect of it.
That would be great. Yes, we're happy to help. We would love other agencies to utilize this tool, and not just the East Coast, that we could get the Midwest using it too.
Claudia Gunter asked, does, oops, it just bumped. Does the Forest Preserve of Cook County partner with any outdoor organizations and recreational apps like All Trails to help get information out?
No, not currently. But something we can look into for sure. Are there any other questions or any other comments people want to make? Okay, well, we can end our, you all can get your 15 minutes back. But if anyone has any questions, again, Laura can follow up with our contact information. We're happy to talk more about this tool, or even, potentially help you develop your own tool, providing those resources.
Yeah, we'll follow up with a PDF of the slides with the links and a recording of today's event. And so we'll send that out as soon as we get that bundled and packaged.
Great, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.